give them. A new interview from the Teamsters president essentially accuses the vice president of doing what you do when you assume things. Just listen.
Teamsters, you better get on board. You better get on board. Better get on board soon. Says it to my vice president.
To her face?
To her face.
I thought I was arrogant. That's really arrogant.
Who does this lady think she is? Like, if I want support from any organization, I am not going to point my finger in someone's face and say, you better get on board or else. But that's the attitude of this whole party.
Joining us at the table is Michael Harriot. He's the founder of contrabandcamp.com. That is definitely an eyebrow-raising soundbite. There's a little bit more to it, but first, Michael, what's your reaation?
Well, first of all, we don't know if that actually happened. That could be his interpretation.
To be fair,
of what happened. We know he is a Trumper. But what's interesting about this whole conversation about unions and Trump and Harris is that the union support for Democrats isn't really eroding. We saw that under Biden, the Democratic Party really made measurable gains. They got that new AFL-CIO contract. They got a million new contracts, and it's interesting because the people who vote for Trump, typically are union workers, majority male, largely uneducated white voters. And it's funny to see them kind of fall away from the party that gave them that support because of this, and go towards Trump when he, specifically has been doing the things that will tear down labor, right? You talk about Elon Musk, you talk about this whole billionaire class that's supporting him, right? The only thing that those guys have in common, Musk and Zuckerberg, is that they want to tear down labor, right?
And Trump actually, in an appearance with Elon Musk, basically said, fire them if they go on strike. But I actually want to play what Sean Fain said shortly after he spoke at the RNC about President Biden's labor record. And just remember, obviously, Vice President Harris served in the same administration as President Biden. Right. Watch this.
You were there when he announced a $36 billion rescue plan for pensions for 350,000 Teamsters. And yet, you are the first major union or the last major union to endorse, and you haven't endorsed him. Why is he not automatically your pick?
Well, because look, he is definitely the most pro-labor president we've ever had and we've ever seen. And you're correct, he did fix pensions nationwide, not just the Teamsters, with $100 billion. So he has done a lot of work on behalf of the Teamsters Union, and we're very proud of the work that he did.
And I mistakenly said Sean Fain. That was Sean O'Brien, of course. But he lays it out there. This administration, who he then declined to endorse Vice President Harris, he called the Biden administration the most pro-labor in history.
Okay, well, there's more to it than just the economic policies of an administration. B, this anecdote we heard at the top of the segment underscores just how arrogant Biden and Harris were. C, it shows just what a terrible politician she turned out to be. She was extremely deficient as a candidate. She gets into a race late and is showing up and, pointing at people and demanding that they get on board. She has to earn that support like any other candidate. Over top all this, though, is that there's something going on in the rank and file union class out there. They have different views on our culture and on American exceptionalism than sometimes their union bosses do. And we're seeing a break between the leadership of these institutions and the rank and file of these institutions. There's more to it than just the economy. There are lots of cultural issues at play here.
I think that's exactly right. It's not really actually about the policy toward unions at all.
Yeah, look, I think it's certainly the case that the union membership within the Teamsters is significantly pro-Trump, and it's difficult for any union leader to overcome that. But I would ask the question in response to what Scott said earlier, is if it's not about economic policy, then what the hell is it about? This administration...
Culture, vibes, there's
if you're the leader of all that they're the problem.
So to be clear, it should be about a pro-labor agenda. That is the purpose of advocacy at the federal level when it comes to unions. This has been the most pro-labor administration. Sean O'Brien said it himself, certainly in his lifetime, arguably in the history of America. I was part of the Congress that voted for a bill that allowed this president to give $36 billion to bail out a pension that was grossly mismanaged by the Teamsters. And I don't regret that for a second, but it was despicable to then see Sean O'Brien draw some kind of equivalency between the pro-labor record of the Democrats and, frankly, the abysmal record that the Republican Party has had on the issue of labor.
But you had a
And I think
candidate
you
who wouldn't
see it
even
in his
answer the
disdain
questions
as well.
about it. They said she answered 1/4 of the questions they wanted to ask
come
her,
on.
whereas Trump came in and answered everything.
You know what's more
She wasn't giving them the
You know what's
respect that
more
they felt they
important
deserved,
than
and
an
not the
interview?
members of that union
It's an
did
actual
deserve.
record that you can point to.
You have to wonder
But
why.
does she want to be attached to the record of Biden or not? Because it seemed to
On
be up
labor,
and down.
absolutely.
You have to wonder why
Because that's
her
the positive
parting
question when it comes
in
to
his
the
face,
election.
if that happened, is more offensive than Trump saying, let's disband the entire policy agenda of these people and fire them all.
I'll tell you what, and I'm borrowing this thought from the political scientist Yasha Monk. There's this cliche that people vote for the candidate they want to have a beer with. But what's actually true is they vote for the candidate that would want to have a beer with them. And working class union workers have gotten the vibe, to your point, from the Democratic Party, that people like Kamala Harris, Democrats in general, just don't like them very much.
And they expect their support. They don't want to earn it.
But you still have to
That's why we support all
reconcile
of
that
this
with the part
economic policy
that
to
I
help
will
with
fire
the
you
So I
on
do
the other
think,
side.
I
right?
think
That's
what
very
Coleman
generous.
is saying is really important to underscore, because I mean, I think politics is about the art of persuasion. It's not just about numbers on a page. It's not
But
just about
but I
the
think
you know
part
that,
of
right? But you,
I
but
think
you
part
know
of that though is
So-
we can't overlook the dynamics of that. The other side hasn't shown really any.
Yes,
I just want to have an honest conversation.
Why do they
I'm
have
not
animus
disagreeing
against
with
one
you.
side when the other side
I'm not
says they'll
disagreeing
fire
with you that that on paper none of
on
this makes
paper,
sense, right?
Out of their mouth.
No, I'm saying like on the policy,
It
right?
does
on
make
the
sense.
on things that unions care about, on things that unions care
The
about. They,
PRO Act, for example.
they
Well,
things
look
that
at
unions
his
care about. The
Secretary of
Democrats have
Labor
delivered
nominee.
more
He's already
for them.
getting stuff from
Even
Republicans for
Trump's
supporting that legislation.
Scott, even Trump's nominee for labor secretary, who Sean O'Brien loves. Here's what a Republican Senator Bill Cassidy says: "I look forward to speaking with Chavez DeRemer about her vision for DOL. I will need to get a better understanding of her support for the Democrat legislation in Congress that would strip Louisiana's ability to be a right-to-work state, and if that would be her position going forward." This is a Republican Party that it does not support unions, Scott.
Well,
and you know that.
Well, this is a Republican Party that supports working class Americans, and the thing about union members in America is that they have to live in America just like everybody else, and they lived through the last 4 years just like everybody else, and they lived under inflation just like everybody else, and they lived under the government condescending to them just like the rest of us, and they lived through COVID, and they were told all these things, and their jobs and their businesses were displaced because of it. They lived through the biggest failures of Biden, and to say, well, we'll give you the PRO Act, which is an abysmal piece of legislation for the entire country's economy, by the way, is not sufficient. These are working class people. They were hammered by Biden, and they knew it, and they voted for Trump because he does not condescend them and tell them that it's, that the conditions are getting better when they're not.
Maybe this is the end. Maybe this is the end. Unions are hastening their own end, because they're basically saying, look, we as an entity, we don't actually represent the economic interests of our membership. So then the question is, why have unions if that's not the case? It's not a social club.
Well, I do want to be clear that the vast majority, so point Michael made earlier, the vast majority of labor did support the Harris campaign. The vast majority, absolutely.
Vast.
You had a problem in the building
Trump won
trades.
45%
Certainly the
of the House,
largest.
so it was a majority.
Well, objectively, it's vast when you look at the numbers and the membership of these respective organizations. She had challenges in the building trades and with the Teamsters and other similar organizations. However,
Cops,
overwhelmingly, labor supported this past campaign. Obviously, she lost. I don't want to paint with broad strokes what's happening within the labor movement, because most labor union members understand that the Democratic Party is the only major political party invested in lifting working people out of the problems that they're facing right now.
And the other thing is that when we talk about labor unions, we're talking about such a broad swath of the economy. Now, it used to be like auto workers and manufacturers, but now we're talking about professionals and teachers and And you know, the
Amazon
country is union.
workers, I mean, people who want to unionize.
And what we saw kind of with labor is kind of what we saw with the country, right? Like, there is a class of, you know, let's be honest, like, not college educated whites that supported Trump, and that is kind of who supported her within the labor movement. And it's not very different from the larger demographic.
But I mean, you saw Trump grow with many minority demographics across the country in this cycle, and then of course he also grew with white, non-college educated labor union members. And so you saw the growth, I think, in many areas that were, I guess, somewhat unexpected for Democrats, but very expected for any of us who were on the ground speaking to people about how they felt about their lives, about how they felt about the border, about how they felt about the economy, who were going to the grocery store, buying eggs, buying milk, buying bread for their families. I mean, I've been on the show many times talking about that and had Democrats laughing about, oh, how are you going to bring this up again about grocery prices? That's what people were worried about, and that was reflected in the results.
All right, guys, everyone hang on. Coming up next, a new surge in homelessness in America. Did the Biden administration's policies make the problem worse, and will the Trump administration do anything about it? My panel will discuss that next.
Your life is pretty smart, but when it's time to eat, suddenly you feel out of sync. Refresh your routine with Factor. Chef prepared.
Troubling report on the state of homelessness in this country. The Department of Housing and Urban Development finding an 18% increase in homelessness in 2024, with more than 770,000 people without a home of their own. Among the causes driving this surge is a lack of affordable housing, a rise in migrants seeking shelter, and natural disasters. So what are the Trump administration's plans to address this crisis? This is a real sad state of affairs for this country, and it should be a black mark, honestly. Almost 20% surge. I should say, HUD says some of it is driven by a surge earlier in the year of migrants into the United States. Maybe that's the case as well. But there's a problem going on in this country with homelessness, with mental health, with drug use, and it's showing up on our streets.
Absolutely. I mean, you see it on the streets of New York City. You see it in cities all over the country. What I think the lesson of the homelessness crisis is, especially for liberals and progressives who believe that it's fundamentally a problem of the price of housing rather than of necessarily mental illness and drugs, is that we need DOGE, not just at the federal level, but we need DOGE in every state. We need a DOGE in every city, because the reason housing prices are so high is because the housing market is so overregulated. You can't build more supply. So we've got to look at zoning laws that are unnecessary. We've got to look at multifamily housing, and that's going to upset people. You know, it's difficult to run on that because I've got a nice view out of my apartment, and I don't want them building a skyrise. So I support those laws that disallow people to build. But we've got to look at the regulations at the state and local level and get rid of the ones that are preventing people from building houses. That's the only way housing prices are going to come down.
And on the campaign trail, President Trump talked a bit about potentially selling federal lands to developers if they are required to have a certain percentage of that land that's developed ultimately go to affordable housing. So we have 650 million acres of federal land that could potentially, some of that be sold off to these developers. That's something that's been talked about for this administration. Obviously, there's only so much the federal government can do. They continue to give money. They could give more. They could maybe look at potentially having certain restrictions on the money and how it's spent. Having some accountability. They, increased, I think, 11% last year in the federal money given to the states, but yet we saw that 18% increase. So finding strategies that work on where that money could go to actually decrease what we're seeing in the homeless numbers. And then, of course, one of the other things that many people have talked about is banning encampments. They can only do that on federal land, so there's not much they can do. That's been done at the state and local level.
Go ahead.
But as an actual economist, right? We have to separate two things, right? The homeless problem is not a problem of the housing supply, right? Like, there are actually more empty houses in America than there were 10 years ago and 20 years ago. So it is the corporatization, like all of this stuff that Republicans talk about, privatization of the industry and less in regulation, all of that has been gone. Like the housing, the increase in homelessness is taking place outside of large cities where it's not, and we know that it's not a problem of affordability, right? It is a problem of the capturing of the housing supply by corporate entities.
But isn't that
right?
also an affordability
Right.
issue? I mean, if the corporate entities are...
And the other part of that, right, is mental health care and addiction, and we've always been fighting it in the wrong ways, right? But I think we have to separate those two things. I think we should be careful because the homelessness problem is not a problem of not enough houses
It's
available.
not enough affordable
It's not
housing.
only enough. It's not only a problem of housing for sure.
Right.
But I think the cost of housing is part of it.
Which has been driven
not only
by the corporatization.
And it's not only a problem in urban areas either. It's also a challenge in the suburbs. And I would say don't throw regulations completely out the window, because HUD had a regulation called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing that would have incentivized, thank God it was put back in place under this administration after the Trump administration rescinded it, it would have incentivized suburban communities to desegregate, change their own local zoning laws to desegregate and therefore allow for more development of affordable housing in those communities, like including parts of New York State. So I think it's really important to be creative in using the regulatory process to encourage development in a smart way that's not
Let
discriminatory.
me play what Trump has said. This is a campaign video that he put out last year about what he would do about the problem of homelessness.
When I'm back in the White House, we will use every tool, lever, and authority to get the homeless off our streets, to address this crisis in our own country. Under my strategy, working with states, we will ban urban camping wherever possible. Violators of these bans will be arrested, but they will be given the option to accept treatment and services if they're willing to be rehabilitated. For those who have addictions, substance abuse, and common mental health problems, we will get them into treatment. And for those who are severely mentally ill and deeply disturbed, we will bring them back to mental institutions where they belong.
So there's a lot in there, and it was a much longer video, but one thing I just want to highlight, because we haven't really talked about it except glancingly, the severely mentally ill are the biggest chunk of the population here, 139,000 people. There right now really is not much out there for them. We don't have a social safety net for people who are mentally ill, and that is why they end up on the street.
Well, they don't need a safety net. We need more mental health institutions. I guess there was a point in this country where we decided that institutionalizing people was stigmatizing, so we stopped doing it. We need mental health institutions. There are going to be people who are going to have mental illness all their life, and they're either going to live in an institution or they're going to live on the streets. That's number one. Number two, I do think the permissive drug culture in this country, which is getting more permissive by the day, is a real problem. You go into homeless encampments and you're going to find largely two things: mental illness and drug addiction. And right now we seem to be on a bent towards drug culture and drug permissiveness. And we're going to rue the day.
Is it permissiveness or is it addiction?
But I think it's
both of those things are
permissiveness is leading to addiction.
Well, so both of those things can be addressed as a healthcare issue, right? Like when we talk about severely mental ill, they don't most people don't become severely mentally ill. We've ignored parts of the population for so long and didn't treat it as healthcare, didn't treat addiction as healthcare, and then you get severely mentally ill and say, wow, we just lock them up into institutions where we know that we can address the problem. We can't solve the entire problem, but we can address the problem better than we have. And the removal of that social safety net, the campaigning to dismantle the little safety net that we have with Medicare, Medicaid, and even Obamacare will increase that problem. And when you talk about politics and this issue, right, aside from the economic part of it, it is a problem of what we believe in and what we value as a country. And what do you value? You want homeless people not in your neighborhood, or do you want to fix American citizens and give them the care that they need? And those are two different things. When you base a campaign on just, we're going to sweep them out so you won't have to see them.
Well, that's why I wanted to play that, because I do think, just if you're being fair to what he is saying here, he is laying out treatment for people who need it. He's laying out help for people who are down on their luck. I mean, it's in there.
But it's interesting that.
But he also talks about removing,
of course, but no,
the visibility of it.
Look, I mean, these encampments and what they have done to urban areas all over this country, it's driving the residents crazy, and it's vexing the local officials. They don't know what to do about it. I'll tell you something else. You talk to people who run urban hospitals and emergency rooms.
They are the social safety net.
Homeless people walk in.
Yeah.
You can't deny them services, and they're taking up a lot of bed space, and it's affecting the local health care. So for people who show up with actual problems, some actual emergency, so it's another area where we don't have the infrastructure to just deal with these people going through these revolving doors, which is why I think the Trump plan, more mental health facilities, more drug addiction treatment facilities, and a less permissive drug culture would be a good thing.
All right, guys. Michael Harriet, thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate it. Everyone else, hang on. Coming up next, a new alert from the CDC about bird flu in humans. Will RFK Jr., Trump's pick for chief health official and a raw milk advocate, be prepared for it? Another guest is going to join us in our fifth seat to bring us the latest on this outbreak.
New Year's Eve Live.
Flu warning. As Centers for Disease Control Analysis says, the first severe case of bird flu shows a mutation. That rewiring of the virus could potentially make H5N1 more likely to jump into humans. And that's a scary thought, and one that's not exactly made better by the thought of RFK Jr. and his preference for unpasteurized dairy. The virus has shut down dairy farms and triggered recalls, but RFK Jr. is a long-noted fan of the raw milk in which the virus lives.
Since I was here last year, I only drank raw milk.
Joining us at the table is CNN medical correspondent Meg Terrell. She has been covering the spread of bird flu. So first of all, Meg, I mean, where are we at with bird flu? And, what is being done to sort of keep the virus away from humans at this point?
So right now this is concerning. So this patient in Louisiana, they are the first patient to have a severe case in the United States of bird flu, and they're also the first patient to catch bird flu from a backyard flock. And what's concerning about the news that we heard from CDC is that while this patient was hospitalized, the virus appears to have mutated and acquired mutations that could make it better at infecting our nose and throats. So the bird flu isn't very good at infecting us, which is why we haven't seen person-to-person spread so far. The good news about this information, though, is that this patient has not spread this to anybody else, and it doesn't appear they caught the virus in this form from the birds. So it's really just in this patient. So we don't have person-to-person spread of bird flu that we know of right now in the U.S. But we are starting to see the federal agencies start to ramp up their response more, to a lot of criticism that they haven't done this sooner. The USDA, of course, is doing this national milk testing. The CDC is recommending testing of workers and people who are at high risk, but there is criticism that these agencies are not moving fast.
Let me play some of that criticism from Dr. Deborah Birx, you might remember from the COVID-19 pandemic.
We're not testing enough, and we know from other viruses that a lot of the spread can be asymptomatic. So we kind of have our head in the sand about how widespread this is from the zoonotic standpoint, from the animal to human standpoint. I flash back to January of 2020, and I'm hearing the same words come out of the CDC.
Like what?
Low risk of human-to-human transmission. Now, our agencies are making the same mistakes they made with COVID.
So the CDC has responded to this, right?
They have. They pushed back, actually, pretty firmly in a statement they gave us tonight. A spokesperson called these comments, particularly about testing, out of date, misleading, and inaccurate. The CDC says they changed their recommendations in November to recommend broader screening, particularly of people even who are asymptomatic. And that they also kept up their flu surveillance through the summer. So typically you might wind that down when you're not in seasonal flu season, but they kept that going, and that actually may have caught a patient along the way.
So this is all happening while Trump is considering RFK Jr. for a top health job. He's announced that appointment. One of the people that RFK reportedly is considering for a job in the federal government is his raw milk supplier. Someone who is an advocate for raw milk. This is not funny, Coleman. I mean, this is a real thing. I think the question here is, are we going to have a public health regime that is going to be controlled by people who don't believe the basic science that's actually done a pretty good job thus far of keeping us safe?
Yeah, look, so I think there's a very real risk of that. I think RFK is a very scary nominee to lead HHS And I've been a little surprised that his nomination hasn't gotten more attention. I think it's been sort of subsumed or whatever by all the attention on Hegseth and Tulsi Gabbard. But you want to talk about a guy who can actually impact our day-to-day lives through implementing any one of his crazy ideas that are at odds with the scientific research. That's RFK at the Health and Human Services.
Yeah, I mean, one of Trump's great successes in the first term, which I think still Democrats haven't given proper credit for, was Operation Warp Speed, which got us a workable vaccine extremely quickly, saved tons of lives. If, God forbid, there were a bird flu, public health would depend a lot on getting a really fast, hyperspeed vaccine. And RFK, whatever you think of him, his priorities are exactly in the opposite direction. He would want a slow roll of vaccine to make sure it's perfectly safe and to put tons of red tape before the rollout of the vaccine, it's not the set of priorities I think you want in a pandemic. But we don't even really have to go to RFK to see the mismanagement, because there's already been mismanagement. Correct me if I'm wrong, Meg, but the first case of cow to human transition for this was March, right? And yet they let 8 other states see similar cases before they said, let's stop selling the cows interstate, which again seems like it does seem like a kind of repeat of the kind of complacency we saw in the early days of COVID. So I hope things...
We are in a very perilous moment, I think. As someone, Scott Jennings, who has a backyard flock yourself.
Yeah, I have a lot of chickens.
Yeah.
And we've enjoyed raising them. I have like 30 of them. It's a great hobby. I do worry about this to some degree. I do think on the issues of the public health regime in the country being less than trusted right now, RFK has really nothing to do with that. They have only themselves to blame for lack of trust in what they did do during COVID, what they said, some of the things they told us that turned out not to be true. We need to rebuild that trust, and it's going to take some time. I mean, people are going to have to be convinced that they're actually being told the truth. This is like how damaging it was to be told 6 feet, we know it for sure. Masks, we know it for sure.
All toddlers.
Yeah, all this stuff that came along that has driven the trust down. Now you got this other things hanging out there. You can see why this was a problem.
And we have vaccine-injured people, which is a big group of people that really, on the right, haven't supported President Trump as much as they did before because of the vaccine following COVID. Now, they came back around in 24, but we saw that
it did slow down the transmission of COVID to do masking and social distancing.
We're going to have to leave it there. Meg Terrell, thank you very much for joining us late at night for this one. Everyone else is coming up next, remembering a pair of icons. We'll be right back. Tonight, we are remembering 2 giants who passed away this week. Business executive Dick Parsons has died. He was known for helping big brands navigate big problems, and that included Time Warner, the former parent company of CNN. Parsons was 76 years old. And sports broadcaster Greg Gumbel has died as well. According to CBS, that is where he spent decades covering football, basketball, and more. Former colleagues like TNT's Ernie Johnson are calling Gumbel a pros pro and a gentleman of the highest order. Gumbel was 78 years old. Thank you very much for watching NewsNight. CNN's coverage continues right now.